lifting up Jesus, opening His Word from Australia, Denmark, Israel, Japan, New Zealand, Northern Ireland, Republic of Ireland, Singapore, South Africa, United Kingdom, Thailand, the Philippines, United States, and throughout the world. You're watching Moriel TV.
Okay, the origins of this were in the largest measure an early Christian deviant sect who had heretical views of hermeneutics and of God called the Marcionites. They believed in Marcionism, and they developed this false hermeneutic along the lines you described in order to propagate their belief that there was some kind of a disconnect between the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New. And they take this further by saying only Paul understood the greater purposes of God. The other apostles didn't. Jesus was only speaking to the Jews in the gospel, not to the church. That was Paul later who explained how the teachings of Jesus applied to the church. This originated with the ancient Marcionites. Unfortunately, a version of it was revived by John Nelson Darby, the founder of the Closed Brethren, not to be confused with the Open Brethren. The Exclusive Brethren or the Closed Brethren are a cult. Darby, of course, is the arch propagator of the myth of pre-tribulationism. But Darby resurrected this. Today, this teaching is called hyper-dispensationalism. Hyper-dispensationalism. John Darby, the founder of pre-trib, taught the lie that the Epistle of James is not for the church. It's only for the Jews. It's part of the Old Testament, as it were. That the Sermon on the Mount, that's not for Christians. That's only for the Jews. That the Olivet Discourse, basically, was for the Jews, not for the church. Don't get your theology of the rapture or the resurrection of the return of Jesus from Matthew 24 or Luke 21. That's for the Jews. That was his thinking. This came from ancient Marcionism and their perverted hermeneutics. That's where it originated. Now let's focus on your question more specifically. Everything in the Word of God, Old Testament and New, is for the church as well as the Jews. The covenantal promises of God for Israel and the Jews do not apply to the church, although the church benefits from God's covenantal promises to the Jews. Nonetheless, they are written to teach us, to learn from the example of Israel, according to 1 Corinthians 10 and according to Romans 15. These things are written for our instruction. Even the Old Testament is written for our instruction, even though it is wrong for the church to appropriate certain national promises that are specific to the Jews, from which the church benefits, but are for the Jews. When the New Testament was written, certain books were written for Jewish believers. The epistles of Peter, the epistle of James, the first book of the New Testament written, and of the two Gospels, John and Matthew, were written to Jewish believers. They're the most Hebraic. This does not mean that what's in them do not apply to the church. It simply means that in their Sitzumleben, in their historical and cultural setting at the time they were written, we have to understand who they were written to and why before we can properly understand how they apply to the church at later times, how they apply to us. You first must understand how they apply to the people they were written to. John's Gospel and Matthew were written to Jewish believers. Epistle of James, the Epistle of Hebrews, the Epistle of Jude, and the epistles of Peter were written to primarily Jews. You must understand that. That's not to say its content does not apply to Christians. It co-equally does. But to understand how, you have to understand to whom it was written and why. The Word of God is the Word of God. It is unified. We can draw distinctions between covenants, and we must, but we cannot separate them. We can draw a distinction between the church and Israel, and we must, but we cannot fully separate them. Replacement theology is completely wrong. On the other hand, Judaization of the church is completely wrong. There's a via media, taught in the epistles and explained quite adeptly by Paul. To know the Hebraic backgrounds of the text, to read John's gospel and to see how he's fulfilling, messianically being the fulfillment of the Hebrew feast from Leviticus 23 and 24, and of the Hebrew feast of Hanukkah in John 10 and so forth. It's important that Christians, even non-Jewish believers, learn those things. Not to observe them in a legalistic way and go under the law, but to understand what they mean doctrinally and theologically. They apply to the church co-equally, even though culturally and by covenant, the observance of them belongs to the Jews. Our Passover, of course, as Christians, is the Lord's Supper, although it is perfectly fine for Jewish believers and their families to celebrate the Passover and have the Lord's Supper within that content, based on 1 Corinthians 7 and so forth. Jewish believers don't give up their Jewish identity. Paul says don't do it, but it also says don't enforce it on non-Jews. There's always a balance, and it's always the extremists who polarize people. In short, the kind of wrong thinking hermeneutically and doctrinally that you are raising originated with the Marcionites. It was revived in evangelicism by early dispensationalists called hyper-dispensationalists, the followers of John Nelson Darby. By the way, not all dispensationalists go to this extreme. There's a lot of basic truth in dispensationalism. It's just that Darby and his followers took it way too far and wound up inventing crazy doctrines such as pre-tribulationism based on it. That's essentially where it came from. It's an ancient heresy. Always remember, there's nothing new under the sun. Now, to say we have to understand the Jewish background of the Gospels in order to properly grasp what it means for us, that's entirely valid and entirely true. But to say it's only for Israel and we don't have to worry about it, we have to focus on the epistles, that is entirely, entirely false. For Jewish believers and their families to observe the Hebrew feasts and so forth, perfectly valid. But to put non-Jews under the law, to put Christians, believers under the law, Paul says that's witchcraft in Galatians. It's totally wrong. We need a scriptural balance. We need to keep away from the errors of the ancient Marcionites resurrected by John Darby and others. At the same time, we need to avoid the hyper-messianic extremists trying to put people in bondage to the law. Yet, we also need to avoid their opposite, the replacement theology supersessionists who try to divorce Christianity from its Hebraic origins. Neither one are true. At Moriel and its ministry similar to ours, we endeavor to bring this balance, this scripturally based perspective of God's truth. And we're not the only ones. I would recommend the writings of Dr. Michael Rydelnik from Moody Bible Institute, of Dr. Arnold Fruchtenbaum. There are others, going back to Alfred Edersheim, taking a responsible view of a Jewish understanding of the New Testament. I'd also remind our listeners that not all dispensationalists subscribe to all of what Darby said. Darby was a crazy man. People like Charles Spurgeon, D.L. Moody, George Mueller all publicly warned about him. He was a despot. He was notorious, and he was a Bible-twisting deviant. He was a spiritual deviant, as was Cyrus Schofield. Cyrus Schofield was another one who took this kind of hyper-dispensational thinking. Schofield left his wife and children. He was disbarred as a lawyer, criminally convicted and sent to prison as a swindler. He was an embezzler, a convicted embezzler sent to prison who abandoned his family and ran off with another woman. He had no theological training or background, Yet this is where these people are getting their doctrine. From Schofield, from Darby, a crazy man who said the Epistle of James is not even for Christians, or that the Gospels, the Sermon on the Mount is not for believers. Just look at the rotten core of where these teachings, particularly pre-tribulationism, come from. Pre-tribulationism is one of the rotten false doctrines that originates in this kind of thinking. It depends on this neo-Marcionism. The theological term, again, is Marcionism. It comes and originates with the ancient Marcionites. Unfortunately, Satan revived it in the 19th century through John Nelson Darby, and has permeated the church ever since, giving us more false doctrines, such as pre-trib. My name is Jacob Prasch. God bless and thank you for listening.